welcome to Red Reviews, the show where we talk about a variety of books from a Marxist and anarchist perspective. And once again, I'm joined by my co-host, Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me, Justin.
Thanks for having me, Corey. It's been a long time. It's been a month or so. I was out for work and other things, and so it's good to be back. It's good to be back on the horse, as it were, to talk about books related to history and theory of the left. And we are, we're entering in an era now where it seems like much of the gains that were made in the centuries under what we would broadly consider liberal democracy are starting to be overturned. They're starting to be curtailed.
Mm-hmm.
I think and it's not just in the United States. We see this global trend over the last 10 or so years of the political right, rightfully, I think, critiquing the failures of left liberalism. So rightly in the sense that it's good that they're making the point, but they're not doing it the way that is constructive, the way we would. Having said that, at the same time, there is this antipathy on the left, or an allergy on the left, to anything that is considered liberal. So if you hear, get that liberal stuff out of here, But the book we're going to talk about tonight is really important because I think it answers both of those questions. I think it answers how can we effectively critique liberalism as a political philosophy? And also, how can we take its best ideas and take them further and build them into a philosophy of socialism? Nice. And so tonight, our book is The Political Theory of Liberal Socialism by Matt McManus, who you've had on the show.
Yes.
Red Review's guest. This book was requested for us to cover it on the Red Review show by our longtime supporter and viewer, Kerrigan.
Yep.
Thank you so much. And so I think that I'm very excited to talk about this book because I really loved it. And I think that there's a lot to learn from it. There's a lot I agree with it, a lot in it that I agree with.
Right.
And I think that it gets to the broader sort of, libertarian tradition or left libertarian sort of view that you and I both kind of share that can learn very much from the liberal tradition. And, as I've said before, my political philosophy is not intended to overturn liberalism. It's to fulfill a lot of its goals.
Right.
Liberty, equality, fraternity, sociality, justice, all of those, fairness. Those are all things that we care about. Those are all things that we value. And I think that there are times where there are some on the left who they're so afraid of anything that might be deemed liberal simply by virtue of the fact that they rightfully see a lot of the challenges and problems of liberalism, right?
Right, yeah.
And that it almost shuts them off from kind of learning about it. And so, like, my hope with this episode is for people to read this book, for one, because I think they should. Right. And get something and kind of learn where it comes from. Because, like, the socialist tradition is an outgrowth of the liberal tradition, to me. Like, those are. It's not like they're enemies all the time. That socialism is, or broadly the left, takes liberalism further and it expands upon it and improves it in ways that liberalism, left to its own devices in specific forms, doesn't necessarily provide a positive vision for people, because at the end of the day, a lot of it ends up just sort of reaffirming the problems of capitalism, of which liberal political philosophy is an outgrowth of capitalism.
Right, right.
So I guess before we get started, in full disclosure, I have not seen your interview with Matt.
Sure.
I meant to do it before we did this so that I wouldn't overlap.
Yeah.
But so for the purposes of tonight, as a form of synergy, if I'm talking about something that you remember he talked about on your show, in the interview show, that's your moment to say, hey, we talked about this on this episode, which you should also check out.
Okay, sounds good. I will try to do that. I'm terrible at that sort of aspect of this whole.
It was like callbacks,
Yeah,
segues. So if I do some overlap with the interview that you did with Matt, I apologize, but I think it'll only be good in sort of reinforcing a lot of these broader ideas.
sure.
But before we kind of get started and everything, do we have anybody joining us yet? Do we have any comments?
Yeah, we got Salim. I'm over here. Yeah, Salim. I'm apologize. I'm not going to try and say your last name. I don't know how to pronounce that. I'm terrible. Anglophone here.
Yes. But thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate you for being here tonight. And hopefully, if you have questions or comments, feel free to throw those in the chat box. We'd love to hear.
We also have Some Random Geek.
Thank you so much for being here.
And
we did an excellent series on their channel about the Democratic Party platform of 2024, which I think people should check out because it's very interesting.
Yeah.
And sort of highlights a lot of what we're going to talk about tonight, which is sort of the aspirations of liberalism but ultimately its limitations.
And that's and over on Twitch we got Nerd Party Gamers lurking.
I'm lurking. All right. Feel free to lurk. Feel free to comment or ask a question. And thank you all for being here. So the liberal tradition, and why it's so important, and why I think what Matt McManus is doing with this book is I think very, very here, which is that we need to what he calls retrieve. He's using the philosophic construct of retrieval, which he ties to another writer named, I think, C.B. McPherson, this idea of retrieval, which is sort of reviewing a past political project and giving people the sort of history of it, the broader theory of it, and how it remains relevant to today and how we can apply it to today, which is very similar to what I think we do on the show in general, which is why I think this book was very appealing to me, because it does that. And so I think what's interesting is in the first chapter, McManus defines liberal socialism with sort of three core principles. The first one is a commitment to what he calls a methodologically collectivist social ontology and normative individualism. Now that's a mouthful, so let's break that down. So methodologically collectivist social ontology. What does that mean? It's just it is a methodological or a practical commitment to embracing a worldview which puts more importance upon the common good rather than mere self-interest.
Right.
So it's about trying to build a political world or a political society or a society in general where our policies, our ideas, our broader values reaffirm a cohesive sort of communitarian ethic. So that's what that means. And then normative individualism, which is sort of it's a moral commitment or an ethical commitment to the flourishing of individuals within said society. And this is something we've talked about before, which is that oftentimes you'll hear commentary from the left and the right where it's like individualism and sort of collectivism are oil and water. They don't go together.
Right.
When in reality, they actually are connected. They go together. They're dialectical. Yeah. They reinforce one another. You know, in order to have the free and flourishing individual, there needs to be a broader common good upon which they're a part.
That's right.
Yeah. And so that's, I think, really important there. And then the second principle is like a commitment to each person. This is from the book, having as equal an opportunity to lead a good life as possible through the provision of shared resources and the design of institutions that enable the development of their human powers. So this is what he calls the developmental ethic. It's different from, say, the acquisitive ethic, which is a term that comes from R.H. Tawney, who we'll talk about later, or the acquisitive society. Liberalism in sort of its more classical forms, when we're thinking of Locke and Hobbes, which we'll talk about a little more in a minute, is more about a commitment to an ethic of acquisition, that you are sort of a rationally you're a utility maximizing, rational, self-interested creature, Homo
Right.
economicus, right?
Right.
And your main goal in life is to acquire things, and by acquiring things, one fulfills needs. Now, some of that's true. I mean, we need things to live, and we have to
Yep.
acquire them. But it's a fairly stifling notion of what it means to have an ethical system, because ultimately, that's the system we live under now, where it's more interested in having
Yeah.
rather than being, which is the Eric Fromm distinction.
Yeah.
What the developmental ethic is that we should build a society where people's needs are met so that they can be free to pursue and to develop into the best version of themselves as possible. And a lot of this concept of the developmental ethic is really tied to John Stuart Mill, who is a very critical person as a part of this whole sort of liberal socialist project. He's sort of the father of liberal socialism, and we'll talk more about him later. And so the sort of third one is a commitment to instituting a basic social structure characterized by highly participatory liberal democratic political institutions and protections for liberal rights, concurrent with the extension of liberal democratic principles into the economy and family to establish more egalitarian economic arrangements free of domination and exploitation. So this is pretty good, right? Like, this is super important here. This goes into his definitions. And what we're thinking about when we're talking about liberal democratic political institutions, what we mean by that are institutions where people are active participants in the production of their governance. This is what in the 18th century would have been called self-government, which is what we call it today. Thomas Jefferson would have referred to it as self-government. Lincoln would refer to it as self-government, in the sense that not only are you governing yourself as an individual, but you're also a part of governing society as a part of a broader whole. Again,
Right.
It's the connection between the individual and society.
Yeah.
And what he wants to do is what we've always talked about, which is that socialism is just expanding what democracy is, which is that we're expanding democracy from merely beyond political institutions to economic and social ones. So we're expanding it to the economic realm, where most people who have a job work in what Chomsky has called like a private dictatorship, or Elizabeth Anderson has called private government, where you are made to conform with the authority, but the authority was not decided upon by you, nor by any of your working colleagues. And so it's about expanding democracy to include the economic mode of production. Now, in a lot of ways, this would come in the form, at least in a liberal socialist form, would come in the form of worker cooperatives, or sort of employee stock ownership programs, where workers would actively decide the leadership structure and the decisions of a firm. But within a sort of liberal, democratic, market-based structure. Liberal socialism doesn't necessarily get rid of the market.
Right.
And as we've talked about before, markets aren't necessarily bad. It's, there are forms of market socialism that could potentially work, but it is predicated on building systems where decision-making is left not just in the hands of those who own it.
Right.
And same with the family. I think including the family is very important, because then it gets into the critique of patriarchy. And we can talk about Mary Wollstonecraft as one of the early sort of progenitors of liberal socialism. And so that's like his definition, basically. And then he has like the three principles. So we have the three principles. It's the definition. So it's, it's the interdependence of individuals. We talked about that before. A commitment to each person having equal opportunity to lead a good life as possible. And in general, instituting a social structure with highly participatory liberal democratic political institutions. So, again, it's that sort of commitment to normative individualism and ethical individualism that's tied to a developmental ethic about developing. People should be able to live in a society where they can develop their talents and their goals as much as possible, tied to democratic participatory structures. So
Right.
that's what liberal socialism generally is. And I think all of that's really good. Like I think that's a good starting point.
Right.
You know, and so when it comes to um, my own perspective, I think the idea of being normatively individualistic, but methodologically collectivistic is pretty close to what I believe. Like I think
Right.
it's pretty close. Um, in that, I believe that individuals should be free to pursue their own talents, their own passions, their own desires, so long as they don't harm others. And that's the harm principle, which also goes
Mhm.
back to John Stuart Mill.
Right.
I think next year on the show, we're going to do, alongside sort of more specifically leftist political books, we're going to do more classics of political philosophy. And one of them that we'll do is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty. We will
Yeah.
talk about
Which,
John Stuart Mill.
I mean, I've read that more than once. So
Yeah. I think, I think it's very important. I've read it at least once.
I read it when I was a conservative.
Yeah, I
So
read it when I was. Yeah, I read it when I was a libertarian. When I
it's a
was a
pretty
right
big one.
libertarian.
Yeah. Um,
But yeah, so that's a good
yeah.
place we can stop if we have comments, questions.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that. Yeah, the I guess the commingling of the community with the individual. That's something that we did cover in the interview with Matt. Because I've said like it sounds an awful lot like what I think of when I think of anarcho-communism. It's like
Mhm.
we build our communities, we build our society, and it's for the thriving of each person because they have what they need and they have the tools to become who they want to be.
Exactly. That's great. Yeah, that's great. So I encourage people to check that out and hear Matt talk about a little bit more on the interview that Corey did with him.
Some random geek said there are anarchist threads of individual anarchists, like egoists, that are for full autonomy, and anarchists are, of course, for collective things like collective bargaining.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
so the individualism collectivism is not a mutually exclusive to anarchists either. Yeah.
That's great. Yes, and that definitely comes through. I mean, that definitely came through in reading Chomsky or reading Daniel Guerin or whatever. Um,
Right.
I think that's definitely the case. And there are the sort of right libertarians, right? Like you have like the sort of egoists, people like on the left would be Stirner, and on the right it would be Ayn Rand.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which I mean, I have some issues with Stirner, but Emma Goldman even used some of Stirner's stuff
Yes,
in her writing. So
that's right.
uh, it's one of these things where you can disagree with somebody and still take the good stuff out of it.
That's true, right? I mean, because Goldman did the same with Nietzsche too, right?
Right.
It's interesting. Like, there's no evidence to suggest that I know of where Ayn Rand read Stirner. I don't think Ayn Rand ever read Stirner, but she
Probably not.
definitely read Nietzsche.
Right.
And her the sort of the objectivists to this day will try not to say that like, oh, she's her strongest philosophical influence is Aristotle. I'm like, that's not true. True. It was Nietzsche. But yeah.
um, got a comment from Sock Now on Twitch. Justin, love your shelf. I have now put my shelves in electronic format. Self-government has had issues in Lincoln's day. Racism was a part of that, but I would say, yeah, there is. To forms of socialism, nationalism, where the government owns all these businesses, or you have market socialism, where you have workers owned and managed business co-ops.
Yeah, totally. I think your comment about Lincoln is absolutely correct, right? Which is part of the reason why the United States had to fight a civil war, right?
Right.
There's the line from Marx where he's talking about the Civil War, where it's like, the rights of free white people mean nothing while black rights are held in bondage or something along those lines, right? So it's like, which is true. I mean,
Yeah.
rights mean nothing when they are not applied universally. And as for my bookshelf, thanks. The stuff that you guys see behind me every episode this is sort of the philosophy back. So this is like, over here is all my Marxism stuff. And then in the middle, and these two shelves are like my broader like philosophy shelf, and a lot of where my anarchist stuff is. So And then I have my little Star Trek stuff and my Green Day stuff up there. And then these green books over here are my complete set of the works of Robert Greene Ingersoll, my thesis, my thesis subject. You know, maybe one of these days we do a Robert Ingersoll book for the show. I mean, he didn't like write a book, but like he published things that were his
Right.
lectures. But you know, he was known as the great agnostic, was very critical of religion, but was also sort of a radical liberal Republican. It was very
Yeah.
cool. But yeah, no, and then I organize them like by subject and by alphabetically, and then I organize them by size.
It's
So within all of those things, right?
a lot of work.
It's a lot of work, right? It's a lot of work. I probably, because like, I think this is a quick diversion, but it'll be a quick one. There's a big difference between book reading and book owning. Those are really two different things, or book
Yeah.
buying. Those are really two different things. I read a ton, but I'm also buying new stuff, and I'm always organizing stuff, and I'm moving stuff around, and so yeah. But yeah,
Right on.
it's a lot of work. But then once it's done, you don't really ever have to think about it.
I guess, yeah.
And I've been like, yeah,
Till you move or whatever.
until I move, right? It's like I haven't, and I've been like this forever. Like I used to have a really extensive CD collection, and that was the same way. It was organized alphabetically and somewhat by genre. Yeah, but yeah, no, I've always been a fairly tidy guy.
Okay.
That's just I'm fairly organized. That's what I like to do. My mind tends to be a little chaotic, so it's nice to have the outside
Yeah.
world around me not be so chaotic and messy.
Yeah, I was similar with like videotapes and DVDs.
Yeah,
Too.
same,
So.
absolutely.
Salim says, why do you think the great modern egalitarian traditions relate to one another purely in terms of apologetics and polemics? Why does each one not take on board the criticism offered by the others?
That's a good question. And I think, do we have any other questions or comments?
Yeah, there's a couple more if we want to spend
Because
some time on this one, or
that question is great, and it will segue us into talking about next sections of the book. So I want to
okay,
use that as a springboard.
Sure. So I guess before we get into that, Summer and the Geek mentioned I have done a lot of video game buying instead of video game playing. My Steam library.
Yeah, it's just too easy. It's too easy to get a bunch of new cool stuff, isn't it?
And Salim also said, seeing as each of these traditions is about generating collective developmental outcomes, surely they gain from mutual criticism. Why do they not acknowledge it?
That's a good question. So, okay. So I think let's start with talking about why don't they talk about it? So some of them do.
Yeah.
So if you look, for example, in the book, there's a chapter related to let's see where it is. It's the chapter on Black radical liberalism, and specifically, it's in relationship to sort of challenges from Charles Mills,
Okay.
who is a Black radical liberal who often criticizes Rawls, John Rawls specifically, because Rawls has in many ways it's a very closed sort of philosophical system. It's not particularly like pragmatic.
Right.
Rawls and his theory of justice is much more interested in sort of base principles.
Yeah.
And so there's that. I think that with each successive generation of sort of liberal thinkers, they are building upon what has come before them. And you get a sense of that when you read McManus's book, because it is organized like sort of chronologically, broadly.
Okay.
And then it's sort of both chronological and then thematic in the same vein. So in early political, so in like the beginning of the book, he sort of talks about how do we get to what is the origins of liberal socialism, and we talk about, we talk about the idea of going back all the way to Plato and Aristotle, and the idea of Aristotle talking about practical reason, man as a political animal, this idea that we cannot survive outside of the context of living with other human beings, that a lot of that is very much tied to Aristotle. And that man is a political animal, like that idea goes all the way through to Marx.
Right.
And then you have, ideas of sort of the early Christian thinking, and how Christianity might be a clear antecedent to liberal notions of equality, specifically the insistence of Christian doctrine that all souls were equal in the eyes of God. This comes from Charles Taylor, the philosopher, who wrote a very influential book called Secular Age. And so you have this, sort of a lot of these other different sort of antecedents. But really, early liberalism in many ways starts with Thomas Hobbes and John Locke. These are kind of the big two. And this is the classical liberal tradition, which today would broadly be defined as being on the political right. It would be sort of libertarianism, right libertarianism. And so with Hobbes, you have this idea of a sort of pessimistic materialism, as McManus calls it. And you have in his primary influential work, Leviathan, you have this idea of Hobbes sort of saying, in a state of nature, man is, nasty, solitary, life is nasty, solitary, brutish, and short, right? That classic phrase. So in a state of nature, life is pretty shitty. And it's under a social contract or under some kind of state that the harmonization of social interests can work together to build a society. So that's where Hobbes is. And Hobbes is also, but the big thing about it is that Hobbes is very much a statist, right? The Leviathan is this like big concept of having the big sovereign who sort of rules over everybody else. But what's interesting about Hobbes, though, is because he's very much a materialist, is that he recognizes how economic arrangements shape things. And that by changing those economic arrangements, that they're not perpetual, they're not God-given, they're artificial, they're created. The idea that institutions are created for the purposes of social order, that's a very big concept in Hobbes, which is very radical. And people would take that even further, which is what Locke would do. Locke did the same thing. So with Locke, who is probably the most influential sort of classical liberal thinker, right? From John Locke, you get the American Revolution. You get the ideas of people like Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine and James Madison. And so they're sort of in that possessive individualist liberal tradition, the acquisitive tradition that we were talking about earlier, that acquisitive ethic. So Locke appeals to natural rights. The natural rights are those that are granted to humanity by virtue of being human, or they're granted by God. So you can either have it in a secular way or in a non-secular way. I recently read an excellent book about Locke and the influence he had on the American Revolution called America's Revolutionary Mind by C. Bradley Thompson. It was both an excellent book and one I also disagreed with on many, many things, specifically because he's like a right libertarian and I'm not.
Right.
But it was a fun book to read because it's very challenging, but it helped set this up. So if you think of, when we think of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So when we think about that, right, in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, and then he says, it's along the lines of like, and if a government were to usurp these natural rights, then the people have the right that the governments are instituted among men under the consent of the governed. This is all Locke. This all comes from Locke, the two treatises of government. This idea that in a state of nature, we actually have natural rights. And the goal of government is to preserve those natural rights from usurpation by a broader social power. So it's freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom of thought, freedom of conscience, right? Yeah. The pursuit of happiness, which is a broader term, but it used in Locke's estimation, it's life, liberty, and property. That one has a right to property, and that property, rightly understood, is property which is granted to one by virtue of mixing their labor with it. This is where, a century and a half later, this is where it comes in with Marx and the labor theory of value.
Right.
That there's something about labor which provides property to others. That's a very classical liberal tradition. And so, Locke is one of those thinkers who's so foundational to the idea of liberal rights and liberal philosophy that we often don't realize how limited Locke's vision really was in some ways, specifically in relation to that sort of possessive individualism.
Yeah, yeah.
That if everything is just property relations, then we institute governments that do not protect people, but that they protect property.
Yeah.
Property has some sort of like unbodied special purpose beyond what humans do. And it's like, well, property is in the service of humans.
Right.
Why are we making it so that humans are in the service of property? And this is where you get the challenges of capitalism. And this is where the liberal socialists would move away from the sort of acquisitive and possessive liberalism of Locke. But what out of Locke is really important is the idea of natural rights, the idea that that governments are instituted among men, and that their consent is from the governed, and that those who are part of the governed have a right, as Jefferson wrote, to alter or abolish it, the form of government, when a government becomes in direct opposition to those goals. That's very radical. It's still very radical, right?
Yeah.
and so like it's the idea of rights. It's the idea of specifically individual rights. It's labor precluding property, and it's the idea of revolution. So all of those basic elements, they're there in Locke that later thinkers would then expound upon. So I would say to the question that why don't they talk with one another? They sort of do, but they just don't directly. And John Stuart Mill and other writers of the 19th century are very much challenging that tradition of like the limitations of having this possessive, acquisitive ethic, and replace it with a developmental ethic where it's not so much about what one owns, but it's about what one does. And that's, I think that's really the big shift. So, and so I do think there's a conversation, but it's not necessarily a direct dialogue. Part of that is it's because John Locke is writing in the 1690s and 1680s, 1690s. Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, the framers of the Constitution, the French revolutionaries, they're in the 1770s and 1780s. Okay, so a century later.
Yeah.
And then John Stuart Mill is writing in the 19th century. He's writing in the mid-19th century. So you have this 150, 160 year period where people are in conversation with one another, but they're arguing sort of with ghosts because Locke is dead, Jefferson's dead, like it's and so you're working upon that, and Mill himself would often directly criticize his own direct antecedents, specifically his father, James Mill, who was also a political economist, and Jeremy Bentham, who was one of the other founders of utilitarianism, who maintained the sort of acquisitive, possessive, individualist ethic of Locke, whereas Mill decided to abandon it. So I would say there is a discussion going on, but it's one that's not so explicit, more implicit. You often learn a lot about the limitations of something by the gaps that it leaves behind. So, there are gaps in Locke, there are gaps in Jefferson and Madison, right? Like the U.S. Constitution is a very limited document. It mentions property far more than it mentions rights. And it also mentions property far more than it mentions God, which is something that I think most people don't know. The word God does not appear in the U.S. Constitution. And the only time religion is mentioned is twice. One, that Congress shall make no law with respect to establishing religion, which is the First Amendment. And two, that there shall be no religious test for public office. So the only times religion is ever mentioned in the Constitution is it's banning religion from doing specific things, or banning the government from doing certain things because of religion. That's the other radical aspect of the classical liberal tradition that McManus doesn't talk about as much, mostly because it's not as related to political economy, but it is right of conscience. The right to religious liberty and religious freedom that is such a core tenet of classical liberal philosophy, from Locke with his treatise on toleration, and Voltaire and the French philosophes. You see this real commitment to right of conscience. So So to answer that question, as we're discussing this sort of broader stuff, I would say that yes, there is a conversation going on, and I do think that they do see limitations in some of their theoretical constructions.
Yeah, I get the impression that because of the chronological nature of it, like because everybody,
Yeah,
certain people are coming after,
yeah,
and like then they're like, yeah, well, some of this was wrong, so I'm gonna build on it in my way, and like, yeah,
exactly. And I would also say too that there are times where they're explicitly reacting to someone who could read it, or at the very least was pretty darn close, like Charles Mills was with Rawls, which we'll get to later.
right, right.
Um, so but before we do that, do we have any comments? Do we have any questions?
Maybe this is more relevant later, but Sock now it was mentioned. Rawls is a very particle board ethics,
That's true. I think
and
that's part of the reason why Matt McManus clarifies that himself as sort of a Rawlsian Marxist. That sort of his normative foundation is in Rawls, but then understanding power and how power works and how systems work, that's what you get from Marx, because you don't get any of that from Rawls.
and Sock now also said, yeah, the issue is Rawls does not include a deontic relation.
Yeah, yeah. It's I think that's one of the real challenges that Rawls is extremely abstract. It's not terribly practical. So but you get hints at what he probably would have believed in practically based on thinkers that he held in high esteem, specifically Mills and Marx.
Um, Velkin made it. Uh, Velkin 999 made it to the show. And Summer and Geek said, yeah, they quickly changed the words to remove property from that text.
Yeah, the pursuit of happiness line is from Jefferson, and it's in the original draft. I have a Library of America edition of the works of Jefferson, and he includes the Declaration in the autobiography. And what's great about it is that you get to read his original version, and then you get to see what was changed. So the pursuit of happiness is there. It's there in the original draft, Jefferson's draft. There are
Yeah.
certain things that were not there in Jefferson's draft that are then changed. Um, you know, one thing that's actually very explicit that was in the original draft that was removed was a commitment to the end of slavery, which is in Jefferson's original draft, but they take it out. And Jefferson
Yeah.
had a very, of course, very complicated and some would say contradictory and hypocritical view about
Yeah.
slavery, which he absolutely did.
Yeah.
He was normatively against it. Methodologically, he supported it in the sense that it
Yeah.
was practical for him too.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think, it's the life, liberty, and property doesn't really have the same kind of, and you have to think about it, right? The Declaration of Independence is as much a political document, but it's also a propaganda document. Like it's
Yeah.
and so the pursuit of happiness, it's like this, it's a little bit, it's much more lofty than say just mere property, but people know what that means. The pursuit of happiness in an inquisitive, liberal, individualist society is acquiring property. Like,
Right.
it's kind of implicit. It's between the lines. People know what it means.
Yeah. That is all the comments for now.
So we'll talk briefly about some transitional figures who get us from the sort of classical liberal tradition to the liberal socialist tradition. One is Thomas Paine, who we've talked about before in the show, who I adore. He's probably the best of the founding fathers. It's like him. He's like the granddaddy of them all in terms of like didn't own any slaves and basically advocated for an early form of Social Security.
Right.
So with Thomas Paine, you see in real time this political evolution of who he was. So Thomas Paine, legendary pamphleteer of the American Revolution. He wrote Common Sense in 1776, calling explicitly for the creation of a new country. Some would argue that he's the first person to ever use the phrase the United States. And Common Sense is much more in the classical liberal tradition. He sort of argues in a similar sort of Lockean vein that, like, in a state of nature, we have natural rights. The goal of government is to preserve those natural rights and to preserve the right to life, liberty, property, so on. But it's really in the later works where you get like Rights of Man, which he's writing during the French Revolution, and Agrarian Justice, where he's getting more radical. Agrarian Justice specifically, so he's arguing for like a pension plan for elderly.
Oh, wow.
That's why Social Security is, the sort of the godfather of Social Security, the grandfather of Social Security is Thomas Paine, because he called for an old age pension program. He also called for a sort of broader universal basic income before that was a thing in agrarian justice. And so what Paine does is similar to Hobbes, where Hobbes is saying, these political arrangements, they're all made up. Like, we made them up and we can change them.
Yeah.
Thomas Paine takes that even further and says, actually, this whole idea of like that there should be people on the top and that there should be people on the bottom and that's natural is not true. That these inequalities are consequences of the structure of society, not merely where you were born because of God or where you are because of because of like birth or things like that. And so it's as McManus calls it, it's this sort of denaturalization of inequality, that we realize that like just like the state is something we made up and we can change it or abolish it, inequality is also something that we've sort of structurally made and we can also unmake it or abolish it.
Yeah, this is in the interview with him, he mentioned this section where it's like people eventually realized that this notion that God made kings who should rule over you was kind of nonsense. And so they created these other sort of ways of doing things.
Exactly. And so in Paine also with agrarian justice, you get this movement towards not merely the acquisitive ethic, but the developmental ethic, moving beyond and talking more about like with the earth, that the value of improvement is good, but it's not, and not just the earth itself. Like owning land is fine, doing things with land is fine, but it's also preserving the land, protecting things is also good. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah. So in agrarian justice, he calls for the idea of a natural fund. When a person reached the age of 21, they would receive 15 pounds as a matter of right. He also makes old age pension, lowering the age to receive a full 10 pounds annually from 60 to 50. So an annual old age pension. So again, Social Security, 200 years before its time, or 150 years before its time, rather.
Yeah.
And he's making this very structural argument that poverty is something we've made and it's something we can unmake. Yeah. And so this is the movement from classical liberalism into left liberalism, which is where Paine sits. Paine is not really like a socialist in the traditional sense. He's a little, he kind of predates it a little bit. So he's sort of a left liberal, as is Mary Wollstonecraft. So Mary Wollstonecraft, who is also talking about class inequalities, as did Paine, but also through a critique of sex and gender. So we're talking about gender relations, patriarchy, and all of that. And when we think about it that way, she's very critical of Edmund Burke, the conservative thinker who wrote, Reflections on the Revolution of France, arguing against the revolution of France and arguing against the sort of expansion of democratic rights and liberties, which Paine also responds to in his book, Rights of Man. And so, with her, it's more talking about the problem of like the misery of the poor and how that often reflects in the way that we treat women and in the way that we treat children. And so we have in her work the same kind of thing where these kind of inequalities could be unmade as much as they are made, but specifically mentions the fact that a lot of these often come with these continued parallels of these inequalities hurt women. They hurt women specifically. They limit women's capacities as human beings because it ties them. And some of them are not even considered full citizens. They're considered property under their husbands, or children are considered property. So you have all of that. And so she gets us closer to that. And what McManus argues is that like we're getting closer to that liberal socialism because both Paine and Wollstonecraft are committed to that normative individualism and that methodological collectivism. And then also they're committed to the developmental rather than the extractive or acquisitive ethic. She calls for relative gender equality in education, marriage, and rights. So this is, again, it's arguing for women's equality, decades, if not centuries, before it becomes more decades, before it becomes a more fully fleshed out concept.
Right.
And that will get us to Mill. And with that, I will take a quick break if we have comments or questions.
Yeah, we've got a couple. Some random geek said Thomas Paine is one of the founding fathers I actually like, and he's a great writer. He did the 1700 version of a YouTube video response with his books, like Rights of Man in response to Edmund Burke.
That's right. That's right. Rights of Man could very much be a video essay. That's correct. Or a very long Twitter thread.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
Paine was a pamphleteer, and my reading of Paine mostly comes through my reading of Robert Ingersoll, because Paine was a very big influence on Robert Ingersoll for multiple reasons, both rhetorically and philosophically. Because Paine wrote a book called The Age of Reason, where he criticizes the Bible and criticizes Christianity and argues for a sort of natural rights, naturalized form of deism that's not tied to Christianity. And that was highly influential on Ingersoll, who would take it a step further in his generation and write the same criticisms of the Bible and argue for agnosticism and or atheism. Whether Ingersoll saw himself as an atheist is it's kind of up in the air, but he's referred himself. He did refer to himself in some letters as an atheist. Anyway, this is the stuff that's left out of this book for practical purposes. But it's the stuff I would have loved to have seen in. Like, hey,
right.
We talk about like the critique of religion, because that's like a big part of the liberal tradition, is like criticizing religion. It's a very big part of it, but it's not there because it's not really relevant. So I understand why you'd leave that out.
Over on Twitch, Sock Now said, yeah, most of the farther left movements in the U.S. Revolutionary period was the anti-administration party, like this extreme anti-federalism in support of the Hamilton ideologies.
Yeah, that's right. So yeah, in the early Republic period, it definitely breaks down between Federalists and anti-Federalists. The Federalists exemplified by people like Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton, and George Washington, and John Jay and James Madison. Madison, of course, would sort of would recount his federalism later on to a point where the Federalist tradition is arguing for a stronger central national government that has explicit powers and responsibilities over national political and economic policy. And we talked about that in our Radical Hamilton episode, the Christian Prenny book.
Yeah.
The anti-federalists were people like Patrick Henry and others who were very skeptical that having a stronger national government would be in the best interest of the citizenry. And that Federalist anti-Federalist divide is still with us today. I would say that sort of broadly breaks down into liberals and conservatives. Although today it's really tough because mainstream political parties are both Federalists. They're not really anti-Federalists. The Republicans like to talk a good game about how they want to leave things to the states and this, and that, and the other, or leave things to localities. But then state governments will often pass laws that overturn ordinances set by the local level. And it's like, well, local cities should have the right to set policy that's not explicitly granted to the states or the federal government. So yeah, they're both kind of Federalists in that regard. But yes, that's a very critical divide and one that we still very much live with today.
Sucknell also said Jefferson was a huge part of the anti-administration movement, but sadly this party decided to merge with the Democratic Republicans in support of this status quo that would insert these Hamiltonian visions into the future of the U.S.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and there's an enormous difference between Jefferson as the political philosopher and Jefferson, the political practitioner. So when Jefferson's the president from 1801 to 1809, you see this massive expansion of federal power in the form of the Louisiana Purchase, which he authorized without the consent of Congress. He did it while Congress was out of session. And when they came back in session, he had them essentially rubber stamp it, which they did. And there's always been this tension between the goals of the Republic, that sort of anti-administration, that sort of the idea of limited powers and checks and balances, with the prerogatives of empire. Jefferson would often refer to the United States as an empire of liberty, which sounds like a contradiction, but to Jefferson it wasn't, in the sense that you could build a nation state predicated on the values of liberty. And liberty in his case was this sort of small d democratic yeoman farmer society where people owned their small farms and cultivated their their crops and took care of themselves and were self-sufficient, and you dissolved power down to smaller and smaller units. But when he was president, he didn't really do that, right?
Right.
So and so I think it's kind of also very telling that like his three accomplishments on his gravestone are not being president. The three are the writer of the Declaration of Independence, the writer of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, and the founder of the University of Virginia. He doesn't mention the presidency at all. And so I think that's kind of by design, right? And so Jefferson sort of becomes this reluctant Federalist, which they all do, because it's in the service of the broader project, which is manifest destiny, westward expansion, taking more and more land from the indigenous population, either through threat or through force or whatever, and then expanding it to include states that would then either be slave or free. And then you get into the debates of the 1820s. You have the 1820 Compromise, you have the 1850 Compromise, which underturns a lot of that. And then you have the concepts of popular sovereignty from Stephen Douglas, and then that gets you to the Civil War. Like, it's a lot of the divisions that exist in that founding period, a lot of those unresolved conflicts, right? That those questions that we haven't answered, those critiques that we haven't been made. To reference our other viewer earlier, like those come to a head in the Civil War. Those questions come to a head in the Civil War. And I feel like we're seeing a lot of that now in the United States too, where we're seeing with Trump, we're seeing this massive expansion of federal power. And we're seeing a political system and how well it responds to that massive expansion of government power, despite the fact that he's a conservative, right? Like they're going to use the big arm of the state to pursue their broader purposes, which is exactly what Jefferson did. So, so they're all Federalists. I mean,
that's right. All right. So on to Mill, I guess, eh?
Let's talk about Mill, man. So Mill's really important. He's really the first liberal socialist. He defines himself that way. And Mill was someone who recognized the limitations of the liberal tradition in a couple of ways. One, he recognized the limitations of that sort of possessive individualism, that it's about acquiring property, this primacy of the importance of getting stuff and owning stuff and controlling stuff, and how limiting that was to a society. At the same time, he's also really committed to a social individualism, as McManus calls it.
Right.
And McManus calls him one of the greatest normative individualists in the history of Western political thought, which is true. If you look at his political writings, especially on liberty, you get a sense of that this is a man who's deeply committed to the individual rights of people.
Yeah.
But what's interesting here is that Mill is someone who's recognizing that our individualism is predicated upon cooperation with others, that you can't just be like a man as an island. And so as McManus writes in the book, Mill claimed that it is not just the individual's sense, certain apprehension of the world, the gradual accumulation of scientific knowledge and its application to the resolution of social problems through intelligent cooperation with other rational beings that define reason. So like reason for him is something much, much bigger than just like an individual,
right?
And in this, he has a section where he's contrasting this with Ayn Rand, who had this sort of very committed sort of methodological individualism. There's that classic phrase that she says where it's like, it is not I who shall die, it's the world that will end. It's a very like that's really a commitment to the self that is way out of proportion, right?
Pretty solipsistic, yeah.
Pretty solipsistic, right? And also ultimately fairly idealist, because like ultimately you don't think the world's that real.
Yeah.
But Mill's like, no. The practice of reason is much bigger than just what I think or what I can learn. Reason is a collective social enterprise in which our knowledge improves over time. So even there, you're seeing this again. It's an evolutionary, developmental notion of what it means to be reasonable, which I think is really cool. I think that's right. And other philosophers would call it public reason. And so he's very committed to that sort of commitment to the accumulation of knowledge as a part of who we He stressed the importance of education and how we can design political systems. And ultimately, now this also gets into the idea of the epistocracy, the idea of that we can build a society, a governing society predicated on education. Mill was very committed to that, as was Jefferson. And unfortunately, you can have people who are very well educated. They can go to very, nice colleges. They could get nice degrees, but they end up either being useful idiots or they end up being sort of apologists for power and privilege.
Yeah.
And so, being educated is no panacea against tyranny or despotism or inequality. And so it's very important to note that. But education is very important to Mill, but it should also be important to us, of course. So I do this show. I wouldn't do it otherwise.
Yeah.
But it's recognizing that it's not the be all end all, that you also have to have a commitment to human rights. You have to have a commitment to individual expression.
Yeah.
So what Mill does is he sort of takes these ideas of the Romantic tradition that's coming up in the 19th century, like Fichte and Schiller and Schelling and Hegel and all these guys who are talking about how the sort of world that the possessive individualists and the liberals have made is a very stifling one. And it sort of destroys our capacity to be our best versions of ourselves or be new or different. This kind of idea gets at sort of its apogee with Nietzsche, right? Mill sort of takes, as McManus writes, Mill sort of takes those critiques seriously. Like he's like, yes, I think that some of that's true, which is why we should have a commitment to that idea of the development, that we should build a society that's predicated on the free and open flourishing of every single human being, where we grant strong individual rights, freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of organization, all of that. And you pair that with building an economic system which ensures those rights.
Yeah.
And so it's Isaiah Berlin's classic example of the two types of liberty: positive liberty, negative liberty, and positive liberty. Negative liberty is the freedom from government intrusion, so freedom of speech, freedom of worship. And then positive rights are rights that are granted socially that reaffirm the other ones, like as FDR framed it in his four freedoms: the freedom from want, freedom from fear, right? And so you have those connections where, in order to build a society in which the free and open flourishing of individuals can commence, you have to build an economic system that provides for that. And so, we can do that in many, many ways. So he talks about it, and he talks about two specific things we can do. One, it's possible to reform the workplace to make it more humane, which is right, either by having stronger laws like workers' protection, workers' compensation, but also going even further than that, the development of worker cooperatives and workplace democracy. The second component of it is redistribution of the surplus in ways that it's more efficient and egalitarian, in ways that the market is incapable of, or sometimes is, right?
Yeah.
So this is where Charles Taylor, the philosopher I mentioned earlier, calls this like an expressive individualism, compared to a sort of acquisitive or possessive one, where it's like, I just want to get all the shit I can. It's much more of the reason I'm acquiring these things is that they will potentially help me become a better person. And so for me, for example, like the reason I love books is because books are a way of being able to commune with a mind, living or dead, that will change you. Every book I read changes me, every single one, and make me a different person every single time. That's part of that developmental ethic. I'm different from what I was before, that I'm better than I was before, that I have more insight than I did before.
Yeah.
That all of that is really crucial to building the world that we want to build, because the anarchy in the bad sense, not in the anarchism, anarchy that exists in the world is often caused by our inability to actually sit down and rationally consider collectively what is in our best interests.
Right.
And so like, that's the thing, is it's like, and this goes back to this idea of why I like liberal socialism as an idea. Because it's like, and I've said this before, the reason I want to live in a world that's socialist is broadly because it's good for me. It's not just because that it's good for others. I think that's very important. And I'm a big part of it. But other part of it is it's good for me. Like
Yeah.
if it's good for these other people, it will also be good for me. Like I don't know how anybody looks at the system we live in and not out of self-interest goes, I don't want this. Like
Yeah. Yeah.
because no one can, unless you're like if you're just this like rich, out of touch elitist prick, like
Yeah.
you're not, you look at the world and you just go, yes, I want to live in something other than this because it will be better to me.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
there's a book that I think he mentions in the notes, or he mentions in one of the notes. It's a book that I've read, which I think is called Socialism for Soloists. I think
Okay.
the author's name is William Edmondson or something along those lines. It's a great book.
Okay.
And that's what I mean is he sort of lays out, he's like, look, you may not like people and you may be more a solitary person,
Right.
but building a world where we all have more collective power over it means that your life will be better.
Yeah.
Just in many indirect and direct ways, it'll be better. And I believe in that. I think
Yep,
that's very
for sure.
important. Because
Yep,
I'm a fairly
absolutely.
solitary guy. I don't didn't really like big crowds anymore, especially after COVID.
Right.
And so, nothing pleases me more than just being able to have time alone with a book. Like that's what I'd rather do. That's my happy place, right? And so I think that's why the appeal of that sort of developmental ethic, trying to be a better version of yourself, and using the tools of society to do that. That it's really hard for people to develop into their best selves when they can't, when they're hungry, when they don't have a house,
Yep.
when they don't have health care, when they're not educated. It's very difficult for them to do that.
And,
So yeah.
I mean, as a person who also generally likes to be alone, I might not need to be alone so much if people were, if everybody was flourishing and we all had the interest in,
Totally.
if the world was a better place, I might like being around people more.
This is this is exactly right. This is exactly right. That's a brilliant point because you're absolutely right. And it ties into that idea that the individual and the collective go hand in hand.
Yeah.
That if we treat the collective better, maybe that will mean that we treat the individual better, which means they'll want to mingle more. Like that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
I think that the world as it is, like there are these, because I don't love like the whole critique of like the madness of crowds or like the tyranny of the mass, like this kind of like very anti-democratic impulse where, individuals are great. You meet them. It's like, I think like there's like a quote of George Carlin's where he's like, I love individuals. When you look in an individual's eyes, you see the face of God. But once you get into these masses, anytime people start clumping or grouping together, they kind of become terrible.
Yeah. The one my friends and I used to bandy about was always a person is smart, people are stupid.
And I don't think that's necessarily.
I don't think that's true. Yeah.
I don't think that's true. If it was true that people are collectively stupid, then I don't think the humanity would have been able to achieve as much as it has. I think that's kind of stupid, right? Yeah. And I think Mill is right that we build upon collective knowledge. That you and I are but a drop in the ocean of collective knowledge, and that we, so yeah, I mean. Yeah, mobs can be bad. I'm not going to discount that, obviously. Sure. But this idea that people as a whole are just kind of stupid is fairly stupid.
I might even argue that like the reason that mobs are bad is because they can be misled by the hierarchy, the leaders that are placed above them. The reason that things are like that is because of the way we've built society so far.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. So you have this problem where the social system that you've built sucks, so no one wants to be involved in it. And because no one wants to be involved in it, it doesn't get any better. So it's this sort of vicious cycle. And and I think that we have to break out of that. For sure. So Mill was definitely more of what we would call a market socialist. He wanted to build in robust public services, worker protections. But he also wanted the state to own some things of the means of production, and then redistribute it to cooperatives. So he's in that market socialist vein, which would be very influential in like the social democrats and the development of social democracy in the early 20th century, and sort of welfarism. And that doesn't mean that Mill is like perfect. Like Marx was very critical of Mill, as McManus writes. Mill's philosophy, as he writes, from a strict Marxist standpoint, Mill's philosophy merely reflected the most advanced wing of bourgeois ideology systematized. More particularly, Marx read Mill as holding that certain laws of market competition were immutable, even if more experimentation in the relations of production and the distribution of a surplus were possible. So, like, Mill was socialist and sort of radical, but only to a point. And Marx says, like, you the problem is not it's not that you're radical, it's that you're not radical enough. It's you've not really thought this through even more. And so I think that's where we get to the limitations of Mill. But what makes Mill great is this idea of developing yourself, becoming better, becoming a better version of yourself, and building a society so that people can do that. And I think that's a really great point to start from. And also that you can reconcile building social systems that provide a certain level of equality and justice, but that also at the same time ensure robust democratic liberal rights, because those are important too. They shouldn't be abandoned. Yeah. Do we have any comments?
Yeah, we got a couple here. Where to start? So a little ways back, Sock Now over on Twitch said, yeah, most of the left today is anti-federalist because we have such a preserved U.S. system that we have not seen a true movement to push against the status quo like we see a support in the left to support some confederation. But we don't see a left wing today that would support these planned communist ideas like Soviet socialism. Even the most principled of these socialists in the U.S. are so far and few between. Most people, I find, are just a supporter of the proto-socialist ideologies.
I think that's fair. Yeah, I think a lot of it just comes down to the sort of the failure of imagination, the limits of our capacity, like the limits of what we can conceive as being possible. You know. I've always really liked the idea of, the sort of left idea of, we're very practical. We demand the impossible. And it's that, and this I get from my influence of somebody like Kolakowski and left Marxism, like Marxist humanism, where it's like the goal of the left is to find the most radical energies and try to move people towards that.
Yeah.
Because like, even if you don't 100% get everything, if you get 80% of what you've got, you're a hell of a lot farther than you would have been otherwise.
Right.
I do think that there is some of that sort of anti-federalist energy on the left that can be stifling. Having said that, though, it makes a lot of sense, right? We're 30 years out from the end of the Cold War. The state socialism of the Soviet Union was very much far from the promise of what we want, of what people would want in a socialist society. And it seemed largely discredited, right? So people had to find ways of being socialist that weren't necessarily directly tied to, say, Marxism or Leninism or whatever. Today, we see sort of a resurgence of that, although I do think that in general, it's mostly politically marginal, as is much of the left.
Yeah.
I don't know what would really pull the left out of a stupor other than popular energies going towards popular initiatives, right? So like, for example, I recognize how limited, say, somebody like Bernie Sanders is or AOC is, right? They're very limited in their politics. They're sort of, to me, in an ideal world, they're the right wing of acceptable opinion.
Right? Yeah.
We talked about this before in another episode where it's like the left is people like you and me, and the right left are people like Bernie and AOC. Like if that was our political spectrum, like we'd be hell of a lot better.
We'd be in a lot better shape, yeah.
Much better shape. But the fact that, like, for example, right now, Bernie's doing this national tour against oligarchy in America, like, I think that's great. I think it's fantastic. He's going out there and speaking to people and speaking to people's frustrations with Trump and his very pro-corporate, pro-business coup he's trying to do. And I feel like a lot of people feel like it's a bit of a bait and switch, although, come on, guys, if you didn't know that from Trump, I don't know what to tell you. But at the same time, people felt kind of abandoned by the Democrats, too. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know what the answer is to get us out of that sort of failure of organization. But I think what will do it is by, supporting popular policies that the public likes. The public likes Medicare for all. The public likes taxing the rich. The public like the idea of breaking up big corporations. They like the idea of stronger privacy protections. Most Americans, I think, would agree on those broader policies, even Republicans. Mm-hmm. The problem is that we have a political culture which has been completely devolved by identity politics that has taken everything and made it all culture war shit. So we don't talk about like the bigger structural things.
Yeah.
And because we do it that way, we not only harm our discussions of class and inequality, we also harm our discussions of identity, because those then become hollowed out by the sort of neoliberal corporate HRification of, like, say, race relations, fucking Robin DiAngelo bullshit.
Right.
Where it's the, instead of like a real commitment to, racial equality or social equality, it's much more of like a box ticking exercise for the managerial class.
Right.
And people see it for what it is. They see it as being bullshit, right? The problem is the overcorrection, where people then, because they are so frustrated by what the neoliberal corporatists do with identity politics, they swing hard right and they become either anti-immigrant or anti-trans or whatever.
Yeah.
I think that's pernicious too, and it falls into the same kind of identity trap that being in the sort of neoliberal mold does too. So you're battling over something that it's kind of like kabuki theater. It looks really interesting, but it's nothing. But it's all a show.
Yeah, neither of them is actually working for liberation for anybody in any sense. So,
and that's why it's always important to bring it back to those economic issues, which Bernie does, which AOC does, and I think that, like, for example, with the House trying to pass a budget that's going to cut $800 billion out of Medicaid. I think that's disastrous, right? It's horrible that they're going to try to do this. It's going to hurt poor people. And they're doing it to do a huge tax break for like 12 billionaires in a trench coat. And it's so obvious and so getting people to see and finding shared common ground with people, right?
Yeah.
Politics isn't like fucking kumbaya. Like, you're going to work with people who you don't agree with.
Yeah.
You may work with people who have social attitudes you don't agree with, but you agree with on the big picture. And if you agree with them on the big picture, it's a lot easier to try to change them on the other stuff. And we've said that before. It's a hell of a lot easier to organize on class and then educate people on identity than trying to organize on identity and then teach people about class.
Yeah.
The last 30 years has taught us that it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So
I guess so I'm going to put all of Salim's comments kind of together because they kind of seem to play off of each other.
Okay.
So first, I watched Corey's interview with Siobhan O'Connor yesterday. Trans people have come under fire from all sides. Norman Finkelstein, Richard Dawkins, it's a long list.
Right.
Each of them uses a conceptual framework to reject these new claims on inclusion. Jonathan Dancy argues that we should argue in terms of consequences, not our principles.
Oh, that's good.
Dancy argues that principles quickly become incoherent in new, concrete situations and lead to traditionalist instincts taking over.
That's great. And that kind of ties into a critique of Rawls, right? Where if it's all these sort of broader principles, but they're not tied to like specific concrete political or economic realities, it's very easy to sort of undermine that project.
Yeah. Some random geek said, I hate that Men in Black too. A person is smart, people are dumb, panicking animals, and you know it. Yeah.
But and to me, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. Like, you say it as if it's a truism, and then you look for things to prove the truism rather than,
I spent much of the last 6 months reading about how that just isn't true. Mm-hmm. Like, people in moments of crisis come together, support each other, build community, figure out solutions to problems. Like,
because if they didn't, we wouldn't be here. We wouldn't. You know what I mean? Like, I just think this idea that humanity is sort of collectively stupid is just not true.
Yeah. Velkin999 said, I don't get the fear of large groups or cities. I jump at the chance to be in large groups because anything else is boring.
I think I was more like you before COVID. I think as someone who had COVID, it sucked. It took me 2 weeks to get better, and it took me months for my lungs to return back to normal. The idea of risking getting COVID, which may disable me for the rest of my life, to go see, Cheap Trick for the third time in concert doesn't appeal to me.
Right.
That's really, and again, this is a social failing, right? Like, this is because our governments did such a bad job with COVID that we just sort of let it rip. And so people are just getting COVID and it's harming them. And we don't know the long-term consequences of getting COVID multiple times does to people.
Yeah.
So, that doesn't mean I don't do things. I do. I love cities. I love walking around in cities. That's one of my favorite things to do. I'm not really an outdoorsy type. I
Right.
love being in big cities. I love going to libraries. I love going to bookstores. I love going to museums. The sort of cultural milieu of a city is wonderful. I love it. And so I love doing that kind of shit. And I'm thrilled to do that kind of stuff. But, I just don't really do concerts anymore. I don't do things where like there's a whole bunch of fucking people and they're all in one spot and they're all fucking breathing on each other.
Right.
I just don't tend
Just
to do
don't
that
do it a
much
lot.
anymore.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Yeah, I think I work kind of alone so much out in
Yeah.
the middle of like literally nowhere that if I get too many people around me, I just start to feel claustrophobic. Like if I go to Walmart, the buzzing of the lights, the noise of the people, the din of the mass, it does just drive my anxiety a little bit higher all the time. So, but I think that's, yeah.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, that makes total sense. I mean, I work in an office with 7 people and, I have a desk and I'm doing my own thing. And it's like, and it is, I mean, sometimes it's very alienating. Are there times where I get lonely? Yeah. But generally I don't. I mean,
Right.
And that's the beauty of humanity. Everybody has a different feel for things.
Yeah.
And that's cool.
Yeah. Belkin999 also said, without someone like Bernie, I wouldn't have shifted left. Now he's less progressive than me.
Exactly. And that's the goal, right?
Yeah.
You learn from someone, you acknowledge their deep and important contribution, and then you go further. That's right.
This is what somebody, Alex Burrell, who I have an upcoming interview with, said to me on social media that that's what Noam Chomsky is to a lot of people too, is like the entryway to a left viewpoint that can then become more radical over time.
Yep. I feel that way about Chomsky. I feel that way about Michael Parenti. I feel that way about, other folks I was highly influenced by the Berkeley linguist George Lakoff, who's a much more like old school kind of liberal. But his thinking on politics, especially on how we frame issues, is like foundational thinking for me. My own political ideas have gone beyond his own form. Robert Putnam's another one where he's a liberal, but like his idea of building social networks and the decline of social networks over time and the decline of collective and communitarian conceptions of society in America are really detrimental to people. Like that's all really important. And so, that's part of the reason why that's kind of the great thing about being on the left is oftentimes you can read a book by a conservative, which is critiquing liberals, and you can agree with them, but for different reasons.
Yeah.
Which is often, so you can agree with what some of the broader, maybe some of the points they're making, but then disagree on how they got there or disagree with some of the conclusions they draw from some of the points that they make on the limitations of liberalism.
All right, on. I guess, okay, so we got a couple left. Belkin999 said, I'm actually super introverted and not around a lot of people. I must like the change of pace.
That's fair.
Yep, totally fair.
Well, that's totally fair. There are days, there's some weeks where I don't have much social interaction. So sometimes I'll just go into town and get myself something to eat just to see people and whatnot. Yeah.
I like the size of the city that I live in because it's not like a crazy big metropolis, but it's not like the town I grew up in, which is very small.
Yeah. It's the same here, man. So like Indianapolis is big, but it's not like big. It's not like Chicago big, right? But it's big.
It's pretty big.
It's pretty big.
I'm from Saskatchewan. That's pretty big.
Indy's pretty big. I mean, but I grew up in the middle of nowhere. I was surrounded by cornfields. My high school graduating class was 120. So I grew up in the middle of nowhere and I loved it. Like I loved that experience, but I love cities. I loved being in New York. I loved being in Washington, DC. I loved being in Seattle. I love being in cities. There's something about, I call it the music of the city, where you can hear trains and you can hear people talking and walking, and you hear cars and you hear music and you hear there's something about that sound that I find very cathartic. It's part of the reason why, I guess if you live there and you hear it every day, it's like not really it's not really that special to you. So you put your earbuds in, you just kind of, But for me, when I'm there, I want to hear it all. I find it to be very, um, I find it to be very cathartic and moving.
Right on. And finally, some random geek said, I love going to conventions like anime conventions, but I wouldn't like being in those crowds every day.
That's fair. That's fair. I'm a big Star Trek guy. I had a coworker of mine ask me the other day if I'd ever been to a convention. I said no. He's like, "Would you ever want to be one? Go to one?" I was like, "Nah." Part of it's also I'm kind of cheap. Like in this fucking economy, when
Yeah,
like
for
eggs are
sure.
like $10, like
Yeah.
you gotta be fucking kidding me. Like, and I got a house, I got a car note, I got a house note. I have to
Yeah.
have my tooth fixed, like all kinds of shit. It's like I ain't got time for that. I ain't got money for that, man.
Yeah. No kidding.
And the money I do have, I usually put in the spare money I do have, I usually just put in and get books. So it's
Yeah.
but yeah, no, I get it. Conventions are cool. I would, they're just not big for me. So in Indianapolis, we have Gen Con every
Oh, yeah.
year, and that's
Yep.
like the big gaming convention or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's always fun because it's like August and it's fucking hot as shit, and people are but they're so committed, and I have such respect for them. Like, I have such respect for people, especially people commit to cosplay where they got all their gear
Oh, for
on and
sure.
everything.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
it's like 90 degrees out and they're like walking outside. And I'm just like, y'all are stronger than me. Y'all are so much stronger than me. I almost want to go up to them like the military and be like, thank you for your service. Because there's just something about it that I find so cool. And I love it.
Yeah.
I think that's the kind of stuff I love. It's just never appealed to me to go, mainly just because it's fine. Like, it's cool. I think people doing it's cool. It's just not for me.
I Yeah, it's one of those things. Like you say, like there's a lot of things that I don't consider for me, but I love seeing people enjoy themselves like that. Like even sporting events,
Absolutely.
like stuff like that. Like I love it when everybody's enjoying something like that.
I feel the same way. When people are having a good time and they're enjoying themselves and they're
Yeah.
happy and they get to take a break from the monotony of dealing with living in this hellscape, like
Yeah.
I'm so happy for them. Like, I
Yeah,
think that's great.
for sure. I think that, well, I guess Summer and Geekum also said, uh, I'm allergic to eggs, so the egg prices don't bother me.
There you go. There you go. I'm allergic to soy, so it's so I don't have to really worry about that either. I don't eat like tofu or something like that. Um, well, we're getting up to the 90-minute mark.
Yeah.
I think we've only really covered about the first half of the book. So what we'll do in sort of closing this up is sort of hit some highlights of the other parts.
Sure.
So we can talk about Marx. We can talk about Marx's critique of liberalism, which I think is very important. One of the big critiques that Marx has of liberalism, and it's one that you can apply to John Rawls, and we can talk about Rawls, is this idea that political relations are situated within a historical material context. John Rawls' conception of liberalism is predicated on this idea of justice as fairness. He has what he calls the original position, which is imagine that you're in a position and everyone's together, and imagine as if everyone has like blindfolds on, so no one knows what they are, no one knows, and you don't know what they are either. And you would build a system that would ensure the rights of everybody, regardless of who they are or where they come from.
Yeah, because you
And
don't know your position in this society.
yes, and it's great.
Yeah.
What Marx says about things like that, and what Charles Mills says about that, is that that's all great and fancy, but like political arrangements are made in historical context. They're developed over time based on specific
Yeah.
conditions, and it's very hard to like. So you might be able to develop a sense of individualism um, as it relates to or individual rights or freedom in a sort of abstract sense, in a sort of ideal sense, but you don't really do it in the practical sense. For example, Mills is very critical of how Rawls essentially never talks about race, never talks about slavery, never talks about any of that in much of his political philosophy. He sort of mentions it in passing.
Yeah.
But what we do glean from what Rawls does mention in passing is, of course, an intense hatred of slavery and, of course, an intense hatred of prejudice.
Sure.
But that's not really Rawls's project. It's much more of a broader normative project. It's not practical. And so, Marx agrees with, proto-liberals like Hobbes that the social world is a creation of human beings working throughout history. So that's very much where he's in agreement.
Sure. That's
Marx,
kind of just a fact, right?
That's just like a fact, right? I'm sorry that reality is Marxist. But McManus writes also about how Marx argues that it is human labor working on matter that creates the social world. Its appearance within thought is very often distorted, disastrous effect. So what's important about Marx is what we call the immanent critique, where Marx is critiquing liberalism based on its contradictions.
Okay.
So, you talk about liberty as if it's this sort of abstract thing that everybody has, but you don't realize how it's socially constituted. And so I think that one of the ways that we think about this is there's actually a quote of Marx's from Capital, Volume 1, where he's talking about the way that the exchange under capitalism is like, it's very free and equal. But underneath that is the forces of production, which are deeply unequal.
Right.
And there's this contradiction between the way that the exchange of goods and exchange of commodities in a marketplace is very, very different from the way the production is shifted, where you have workers and you have owners and you have the contrast between the workers and the owners. I'm going to try to find this quote because I think it sums up a lot of that sort of liberal critique, or the critique of liberalism. Yes, here we go. So this is great. So he's talking about the sphere of commodity exchange, okay? What reigns in that system is exclusively freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom, because only the free wills of the buyer and seller of a commodity, for example, labor power, determine how these figures act. And then if my PDF doesn't die, the entrance into business dealings as free persons, equal before the law. The end result is the contract that represents a joint legal expression of their wills, equality, because they interact only as commodity owners and exchange an equivalent for an equivalent. Property, because each owner does what he wants with only what is his, Bentham, and that's in reference to Jeremy Bentham. Because each cares only about himself. And what he basically talks about is that's sort of the ideal. That's what we think of as the ideal in the situation. But there's the reality, which is that the systems of production where wealth is created are deeply unequal.
Yeah.
So that's what's known as the immanent critique. Marx is sort of showing people the contradictions inherent in a liberal democratic system. It all looks free and equal on paper.
Yeah.
But in reality, you get underneath that and it's actually deeply unequal and can be deeply oppressive.
Yeah, because it's free and equal, right? Because I have money and you have a product and I can exchange you this money for a product. The end.
Exactly.
No context required.
Exactly. And so, there's a lot more to the book, but for the sake of time, we'll sort of cut it short. So there's religious dimensions. So we can talk about like R.H. Tawney and the sort of Christian socialist tradition. I've thought about doing religion and the rise of capitalism for the show. And the fact that we're not going to get to talk about Tawney tonight gives me the go ahead. We're probably going to do that book because obviously C.B. McPherson, the Canadian political thinker who had a radical liberalism and the idea of retrieval, which McManus pulls from. There's the left populist movement of people like Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau, which I don't really have that much love for. I don't really like either one of them particularly very much. The only thing I will give Laclau and Mouffe credit for is the idea of what they call agonistic politics, which is the idea that politics is fundamentally confrontational. It's people battling it out over power, which is true. That's absolutely true. Yeah. And that's a holdover from Marx. And so, to overall summarize, I think this is an excellent book. I think people should read it. I think people should check it out. It's a book that I had a tremendous amount of fun reading. McManus is a very good writer. He's very logical. It's all laid out very logically. I'm never having to be like, wait, what was that? Like he's an incredibly crisp, clear writer, which you don't always find in academic writing generally. I think this is a book that really does a nice job of straddling the line between being, I think, a scholarly work, but also being a work for the general public. It's something that most people could pick up and read. They wouldn't have much trouble reading it. And I also think that it's worthwhile to bring this tradition back and have people think about it. because there's a lot to like in liberal socialism, this idea of protecting individual rights while creating collective responsibilities and benefits for all in service of those individual rights.
Yeah.
I think that's a worthwhile tradition to sort of learn from.
Yeah, for sure. It's got its echoes in, I mean, in Marxism and in anarchism and other
Yeah,
various left philosophies that may not be rooted in liberalism, but they're there. These things are there.
absolutely. Yeah, the goal of, I think, socialism is not so much to undermine liberalism, but is to transcend it.
Yeah.
And by transcending it, we mean that in this sort of, I guess, like sublate it in some ways, like in the Hegelian sense, where we are overcoming it to get to something even better and greater, kind
Yeah.
of building on it, you know, and because as we've learned, or the way I always think about it is there's a great there's a Rush song that I really like. I think it's called Secret Touch. And the line that I really like in the song is the way out is the way in. It's like, yes, there you go, dude. That's
Yeah.
that's the idea of transcendence. It's the way out is the way in.
Yeah.
The way out of liberalism is through it.
Yeah. That's right.
The way into socialism is through it. Like, it's through capitalism. Like, you have to go through these things to come out the other end. I think that's the way out is the way in. And I think that understanding that and having a grasp of what liberalism's achievements and limitations are is very crucial for a socialist project.
Yeah.
I think
sure.
that liberal is often thrown around as an epithet and not a critique.
Yeah,
And
which I'm guilty of myself.
We're all guilty of it, right? We're all guilty of it.
So,
But we have to, if we're at the very least, if we're going to throw the epithet around, pair it with a critique. And if you want to pair it with a critique, this book gives you the tools to do it.
Right on. So I guess, what are we covering next time?
Next time, we are doing a classic of anarchist thought that I'm surprised we've gotten this far in doing this show. We've never talked about him. We're gonna do God and the State by Mikhail Bakunin.
Yes.
Finally doing Bakunin on the show. I can't believe it. Like, I go through our backlog and I'm like, oh, we never talked about Bakunin. So, because people did ask us to do more anarchist stuff, and I agree. Yeah. So we're going to do God and the State. This is a book I remember reading and loving years ago, and I wrote about it when I wrote about Emma Goldman.
Right.
And how influential I think Bakunin was on Goldman too. And so it'll be really, I think, fun to go through that book. Sure. So it'll be a classic of anarchist thought next time. Nice.
So I guess that just leaves, where can people find you?
You can find me at justinclark.org. That's the website right down there. I have recently published a piece with Counterpunch. I'm going to be trying to be more of a regular writer for Counterpunch. They have graciously accepted an article I wrote. The article is about challenging labor bureaucracy and how I think that Trump's pick for labor secretary is not as great as it seems on the surface.
Okay.
So that'll be, I think a good place to start. I'm also working on an article right now about crypto, which I hope the good folks at Counterpunch will also publish as well.
Right on.
And I'm analyzing crypto through the lens of John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist's idea, his book on short history of financial euphoria. I have the blog. I have a new short book review series on presidential history you can check out. That's at justinclark.org. Cool. And I'm working on a bunch of other different things, including I'm eventually going to be working on a talk about Lincoln and the politics of humility. I'm going to be working on something about the Four Freedoms FDR, trying to tie history and theory a little bit. So those will be things that'll probably be coming down the pike. Still working on the Gore Vidal series, still working on the Green Day American Idiot thing. So, just keep posted. Most of my stuff will be on my website, justinclark.org. Also, you can find me on social media at Justin Clark PH. PH stands for Public History. You can find me on Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. I would really like to eventually leave Meta platforms behind and just be on Blue Sky. So I want to get my follower count up on Blue Sky. I think I want to try to get to like half of what I have on Instagram before I kiss Instagram goodbye.
Yeah.
But I do eventually want to get off the meta platforms because I think Zuck is a douchebag and I would rather not. But having said that, though, and I will say this for our viewers, depending on when this is recorded, this may change. But I will say this. Last week tonight, John Oliver did an episode on Facebook this past week, and he put together a website where you can go to where you can go through the settings on Instagram or through Facebook and like your meta platforms. If they're all connected, you can change your privacy settings so they don't track you as much with ads.
Oh, cool.
So I would just type in like last week tonight, Facebook, like privacy, and you might get it. I think he also repurposed a website from the pandemic that he used, which is like, I think it's like send John Oliver rat@erotica.com or something like that. It's like a long story.
Yeah.
I'm buying rat erotica during the pandemic. But anyway, go check that out. Let's make sure that, Musk gets less of your money, Bezos gets less of your money, and Zuckerberg gets less of your money.
For sure. All right. Well, thank you everybody for the chat. I thought that this was quite a good comeback after being gone for a month. It was a very nice chat.
Thank you guys.
I really appreciate everybody who listens and watches, and thank you again.
And all the new folks tonight. There were new folks tonight. We really appreciate your comments. Thank you so much for joining us.
Right on. See y'all next time.
See you next time.
All right, folks. That's all for now. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. I really appreciate it, and it helps me keep the power on. Thanks to my top patrons, Damian Marie Athope, Some Random Geek, Justin Clark, Dan F. Smith, and Lisa Glass. And thank you to my new patrons. You can stay tuned for the list of patrons at the end to see your name listed. If you aren't a patron and want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can send a one-time donation to buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. I also have a Substack where you can subscribe for free or you can donate per month. And lastly, you can get a paid subscription on Spotify that will give you the same access to bonus content and extra long episodes. If you can't contribute financially, then I would like on YouTube or a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts or one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser would be great. If you want to find more from me, then make sure to check out the show notes for links to all my stuff, or check out my link tree. It's linktr.ee/skepticalleftist. That's where you can find all of my social media spaces and communities. You can also email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening or watching. Make sure to leave a comment on the video, join your local org, print off some posters or pamphlets, and spread the propaganda. Also, stick around for a clip from this episode's post-show chat.